When a reporter tried to humiliate Clint Eastwood, Barron Trump did the unexpected. His words left the room in stunned silence. What did he say? Stay tuned for the shocking truth. The studio was a battlefield, though no weapons were drawn. Beneath the blinding overhead lights, the air felt heavy, thick with the kind of anticipation that precedes a public execution. At the center of it all sat Clint Eastwood, his weathered face carved with the lines of a life well lived. His eyes, sharp as ever at 94, scanned the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen and endured far worse. He was dressed simply, an unassuming gray blazer over a dark shirt, but there was nothing unassuming about his presence. Across from him, perched on the edge of her sleek, glass-topped desk, was Claire Daniels, a journalist known for her brutal, career-defining interviews. With her short auburn hair perfectly styled and her tailored navy suit crisp and commanding, she exuded the polished confidence of someone who had dismantled legends before and fully intended to do so again. Behind Clint, standing like a silent sentinel, was Barron Trump. At 19, he was already an imposing figure, standing over 6'7", his presence as deliberate as it was unexpected. The public knew him as the son of the 47th President of the United States, a young man raised in the shadows of power, but few had ever heard him speak outside of scripted formalities. Now he was here, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Claire with an intensity that was neither aggressive nor fearful, just watchful, calculating. He had not been scheduled to attend, but when he learned the interview would center on Clint, a man he considered more than a mentor, he made sure he was there. Whatever this was, he wouldn't let Clint stand alone. A red light flashed. The countdown began. 3. A quiet shift in the audience, an almost imperceptible inhale as people readied themselves for the storm to come. 2. Claire straightened her posture, flicking through her notes one last time before setting them down. A well-rehearsed smirk played at the corner of her lips. She lived for moments like this. 1. The silence stretched a fraction too long before the camera's on-air sign blinked to life. "Good evening, America," Claire began, her voice smooth as silk yet laced with something sharper. She turned slightly, eyes locking onto Clint. "Tonight we're joined by a man who needs no introduction, Clint Eastwood, actor, director, Hollywood icon. A legend, some say. Others, however, might call him a relic of a bygone era, a man desperately clinging to relevance in a world that's left him behind." A deliberate pause. "And next to him," she continued, shifting her gaze, "is Barron Trump, son of the president, heir to an empire, and someone who, by all accounts, has had his life handed to him." Another pause. "But the real question is, why is he here?" The trap was set. The battle had begun. Claire leaned forward, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the sleek glass surface of the desk. The studio lights reflected off the polished table, casting an eerie glow that only intensified the tension hanging in the air. Her lips curled into a practiced smile, one designed to disarm before the strike. She had played this game before, built her career on it, and tonight would be no different. Adjusting the lapel of her tailored navy blazer, she let the silence linger just long enough to make the moment feel uncomfortable, just long enough to let her guests know exactly who was in control. She turned her attention to Clint first, her gaze cool, detached, as if she were addressing a relic displayed behind museum glass. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice carrying the effortless confidence of someone who had already decided the verdict. "Your career spans over 6 decades. You've won Academy Awards, directed some of the most critically acclaimed films of all time, and yet in recent years, there's been a growing narrative, one that suggests you're no longer relevant, that Hollywood has moved on, that America has moved on. Tell me, why are you still here?" Her words, though carefully measured, dripped with condescension. The phrasing was deliberate, not what motivates you to keep working, or how do you feel about your legacy, but why are you still here? As if he were an aging monarch clinging to a crumbling throne. The audience sat in silence, waiting, watching. Clint didn't react right away. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, unbothered, unfazed. He had faced down studio executives, political opponents, and men twice his size on screen and off. A reporter with a sharp tongue wasn't about to shake him. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. "Well, he said finally, his voice low and steady, gravelly with time, but no less commanding. "Last I checked, being alive still gave a man the right to show up." A murmur rippled through the audience, a few chuckles escaping despite the tension. Claire's eyes flickered, but she recovered quickly, shifting gears without missing a beat. "Fair enough," she conceded, her smirk tightening at the edges. "But let's talk about influence then. You've been a vocal supporter of the Trump family, particularly the president. And some say that's the only reason you're still in the public eye. That your relevance now comes not from your work, but from your association with power." Beside Clint, Barron's posture stiffened, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. Claire noticed. She turned her attention to him, the predatory glint in her gaze sharpening. "And that brings me to you, Barron." Her voice took on a softer edge, as if she were shifting from interrogation to curiosity. "You're 19. Your father is arguably the most polarizing political figure of the century. You've grown up in the shadow of one of the most scrutinized presidencies in history, and yet you've remained mostly silent until now." She let the moment stretch, watching him carefully, waiting for the weight of her words to sink in before delivering the final blow. "So tell me," she said, tilting her head, "are you here tonight to defend Clint Eastwood's legacy, or are you just here to protect your father's?" The room held its breath. For a moment, Barron didn't move. He sat as still as stone, his expression unreadable, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Claire's with unsettling calm. The air in the studio had shifted, no longer charged with the performative tension of a political sparring match, but something deeper, something real. Claire had expected a nervous 19-year-old, someone who would fumble for words, glance toward Clint for reassurance, or if she were lucky, lose his composure entirely. Instead, Barron simply exhaled, slow and measured, as if he had been expecting this exact moment all along. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the polished table, his voice low but steady. "I'm here," he said, his words deliberate, "because when people like you try to rewrite history, someone has to remind them of the truth." The sharpness in his tone cut through the silence like a blade. Claire blinked, caught off guard, but quickly masked her surprise with a practiced smirk. She lifted her notepad slightly, flipping through her pages as if searching for the perfect counter. She hadn't expected him to fight back. "The truth," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Well, that's an interesting word, coming from someone whose entire life has been shaped by carefully crafted narratives." She gestured vaguely. "You're the son of the most powerful man in the country, the heir to a name that has dominated global headlines for years. You say you're here to set the record straight, but let's be honest, how much of your life has ever really been your own?" The insult was thinly veiled, designed to provoke. The audience shifted, sensing the subtle escalation, but Barron's expression remained unchanged. He tilted his head slightly, considering his response. Then, in a voice both quiet and razor sharp, he said, "You think because I was born into a legacy, I don't understand what it means to build one?" A flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossed Claire's face, but Barron didn't give her time to recover. His voice gained momentum, unwavering yet controlled. "I've watched people try to tear my father down since the day I was born. I've seen headlines rip apart my family, twisting reality into something unrecognizable. And through all of it, I've learned one thing: legacies aren't given, they're earned." Clint Eastwood didn't become a legend because he clung to power. He became one because he stood for something bigger than himself. Because when the world pushed, he didn't back down. And now you sit here trying to reduce his life to a headline? The audience was dead silent. Even Claire, who had built a career on controlling interviews, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen. Barron leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. His next words were spoken softly, but they landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Sometimes the brightest lights are the ones people fail to see. Careful not to miss them. And with that, the balance of power in the room shifted. Claire inhaled sharply, sensing the control of the interview slipping through her fingers. She had come prepared for verbal duels, for politically charged deflections, and for a careful game of public relations maneuvering. But this was different. Barron had met her challenges head on, countering every accusation not with defensiveness, but with something far more disarming. Truth. And now she was running out of ways to spin it. Desperation creeping into her voice, she straightened her notepad and pulled out a worn manila folder, its edges frayed from years of handling. With calculated precision, she slid it onto the table, letting the sound of paper against glass punctuate the moment. "Since we're discussing legacies," she said, her voice smooth but edged with intent, "let's talk about the stories that don't make the headlines." She turned to Clint, her gaze steady. "Mr. Eastwood, there have been rumors, whispers, really, that you've used your influence in ways that go far beyond Hollywood, that you've done more for the Trump family than just offer moral support." She tapped a single finger against the folder. "Would you care to comment?" Clint didn't look at the folder. He didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat. Instead, he let out a low, amused chuckle, gravelly, measured, entirely unimpressed. "I don't deal in whispers, ma'am," he said, "and I sure as hell don't explain myself to people chasing shadows." Claire's jaw tightened, but before she could press further, Barron moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached across the table, pulled the folder toward him, and flipped it open. His eyes flicked over the contents, a few grainy black and white photographs, an old newspaper clipping, a classified report with half the text redacted, but he didn't need to read them to know what they contained. He already knew the story, because he had lived it. With a quiet exhale, he lifted his gaze to Claire, and for the first time that night his composure cracked, just slightly. His voice when he spoke was steady, but there was something raw beneath the surface, something heavier than the controlled confidence he had displayed before. "You want a headline?" he said, his fingers tightening on the folder's edge. "Here's one. Clint Eastwood saved my life." A ripple of shock swept through the audience. Even Claire's carefully constructed mask faltered for half a second before she caught herself. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, her previous bravado melting under the weight of Barron's words. Barron swallowed, his jaw tightening, as if forcing himself to speak something he had held back for too long. "When I was 15, my father was on the campaign trail in Texas," he said. "There was an incident, a security breach. A man armed with a weapon got through the barriers and made it backstage. My security detail froze. Clint didn't." For the first time since the interview began, Clint looked away. Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "He was the one who stepped in, the one who shielded me, who acted when others hesitated, and he's never once spoken about it because that's the kind of man he is." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Claire's fingers twitched against her notepad, her previous confidence reduced to uncertainty. "Why hasn't this story ever been told?" she asked, but the question came softer now, no longer an accusation, just curiosity. Barron's gaze darkened, "Because real heroes don't need headlines." And with those words, the entire direction of the interview changed. The studio had never been this quiet. The weight of Barron's revelation lingered in the air, thick and undeniable, pressing down on everyone in the room. Even Claire, who had entered this interview with the intention of dismantling Clint's legacy, now found herself staring at the young man before her, not as the privileged son of a president, not as a carefully groomed political figure, but as someone who had lived through a moment few could ever understand. The usual glint of challenge in her eyes had faded, replaced by something softer, something closer to respect. She exhaled slowly, tapping her pen against her notepad as if grounding herself before speaking. "Barron," she began, her voice quieter now, the sharp edges smoothed by the weight of his words. "I can see why Clint means so much to you, but I have to ask, is it really just about that one moment, or is there more?" Barron turned slightly, glancing at Clint, who remained as composed as ever. For a man who had spent decades in the public eye, Clint had mastered the art of saying everything without saying a word. But this time, there was something different, a heaviness in his gaze, an unspoken truth in the way his fingers curled ever so slightly against the chair's armrest. Barron took a slow breath, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Clint isn't just my godfather. He's the man who taught me what it means to stand tall, even when the world is watching, waiting for you to fall." A pause, the kind that forces everyone to listen. "When my dad became president, everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't just a kid anymore. I was a headline, a talking point, a target. People who had never met me decided who I was. And in the middle of all that, Clint was the one who reminded me that a name doesn't make a man, his actions do." Claire's gaze flickered to Clint, who finally spoke. His voice, rough but unwavering, filled the room with a quiet strength. "The kid needed someone. I happened to be there." Barron let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You always say that," he muttered. Then, looking back at Claire, his expression turned serious again. "But it's not just about what happened that day in Texas. It's about every day since. Clint taught me that loyalty isn't about convenience. It's about commitment. It's about standing by the people who trust you, even when the world tells you not to." Claire swallowed, struggling to maintain her composure. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure how to follow up. The narrative she had carefully constructed before stepping onto that stage had unraveled before her eyes. Finally, she leaned back, pressing her pen against her notepad as if trying to steady herself. Then softly she asked, "And Clint, what does Barron mean to you?" The legendary actor turned to the young man beside him, his weathered face unreadable for a long moment. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "He's got more strength than most men I've known, and I'll stand by him, always." And in that moment, the interview wasn't about Clint Eastwood's past, Barron Trump's name, or politics. It was about loyalty, it was about family, and nothing could tear that apart. The interview ended, but its impact was just beginning. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras powered down, a hush still lingered over the set, as if no one dared to break the gravity of what had just unfolded. Claire Daniels, usually the first to leave, remained seated, staring at her notepad with an expression caught between disbelief and quiet reflection. She had entered this room looking for weaknesses, expecting rehearsed talking points and political posturing. Instead, she had uncovered something real, something undeniable. But outside the walls of the studio, the world was anything but quiet. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of Barron's poised but passionate defense of Clint went viral, shared by both supporters and skeptics alike. Some praised his composure, calling it the moment he had stepped out of his father's shadow. Others, caught off guard by Clint's rarely discussed act of heroism, demanded to know why the media had never covered it before. News outlets scrambled to adjust their narratives, rushing to either amplify or discredit the interview. On one side, headlines lauded Clint Eastwood, a true American hero, and Barron Trump breaks his silence with unshakable strength. On the other, the usual detractors framed it as a carefully staged PR move or a desperate attempt to rewrite history. But the people had already decided. Across the country, veterans organizations and conservative figures publicly voiced their support, while independent commentators, many of whom had been critical of both Clint and Barron in the past, admitted the interview had left them reconsidering their assumptions. Even longtime Hollywood insiders, many of whom had written Clint off as a relic of the past, found themselves acknowledging the power of loyalty, the weight of a man's actions over decades. Yet, as with all things in the public eye, the backlash came just as swiftly. A rival network, desperate to regain control of the narrative, dug into Clint's past, resurfacing long-buried controversies and rehashing tired accusations. The attacks were predictable. Whispers of an old baseless scandal, speculation about his politics, attempts to frame his legacy as tainted. It was a classic strategy. When a man's truth is too powerful to dismiss, they try to drown it in noise. Barron refused to let that happen. Standing in front of the White House, a simple American flag waving behind him, he recorded a direct response. His words, calm yet firm, echoed across the country. Clint Eastwood doesn't need defending. His life speaks for itself. But if you think for 1 second that I'll stand by and let his legacy be tarnished by cheap attacks, you don't understand loyalty. The video spread like wildfire, forcing even his critics to acknowledge what was clear. Barron Trump was no longer just a last name. He was a voice. And as Clint watched the broadcast from the quiet of his California ranch, he simply smiled. The kid had found his own way forward. At its core, this story is about loyalty, integrity, and standing firm in the face of adversity, values that resonate deeply, especially with those who have lived long enough to see how rare they can be. Clint Eastwood's quiet heroism reminds us that true character isn't built on headlines or public approval, but on the choices we make when no one is watching. Barron Trump's journey, stepping out of his father's shadow to defend a man he respects, speaks to the importance of honoring those who have guided us and standing up for what is right, even when the world tries to tear it down. In today's fast-moving, often ruthless world, where loyalty is fleeting and truth is drowned out by noise, this story reminds us to value the people who stand by us, not just in moments of victory, but in times of trial. Who in your life has shown you the meaning of loyalty and strength? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may inspire someone else to reflect on the values that truly matter.